Ethan's eyes opened. The night around him was a thick, cloying substance, so dense it felt like it could be carved. A strange, metallic tang, something like rust and decay, had seeped all the way to the back of his throat. He was not in the familiar comfort of his own bed. Ethan reached a hand down to feel the surface beneath him. His palm came away slick and wet. He was lying in a shallow pool of frigid water. It was barely an inch deep but bitingly cold, the sensation too real to be a dream. A blinding sheet of white light, like a stampeding flock, flared into existence before him, making his eyelids ache. He raised a hand to shield his face as a voice, faint and exhausted, drifted from within the glare. He was told that he had arrived. A stiletto dagger clattered onto the ground in front of Ethan with a sharp, metallic ring. The voice, thin as if diluted by water, spoke again, informing him that he had to kill him. Ethan asked who he was meant to kill. The voice replied with a name, Julian Astor. A splitting headache tore through Ethan's skull, making it impossible to grasp the situation. He felt only that the name Julian Astor was intensely familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it. He decided to refine his question for clarity, asking who the speaker was. The voice identified itself as the Arbiter of Worlds. Judging by its sound, the Arbiter was on its last legs. If Ethan didn't hurry and get some answers, the entity might just flicker out. He fought through the pain, opening his mouth to demand an explanation, but the words felt like cotton, stuck fast in his throat. He remembered who Julian Astor was. To his neighbors and the few people in his small town, Ethan Vance was the eccentric, the loner who kept strange hours. He had a penchant for the obscure and a love for dusty, forgotten books. He was a man who could befriend anyone, living with a freewheeling spirit that often led him to make reckless bets just for the thrill of it. When he had money, he'd spend it lavishly on a rare first ion. When he was broke, he'd hardly notice, content to entertain himself with his own imagination. Fortunately, his family was exceptionally indulgent, letting him live his unconventional life. One day, bored and restless, Ethan had read one too many fantasy novels and decided to write his own. Julian Astor was the antagonist from his unfinished manuscript, a character of devastating beauty and equally devastating cruelty. It was strange, but the name Julian Astor had first appeared to him in a dream. When Ethan awoke, drenched in sweat, he had forgotten the dream specifics but remembered the name with perfect clarity. He had immediately started writing the story. The process was astonishingly smooth, and within a month, he had nearly 10,000 words. His novel had no conventional heroes. It was about a group of demigods and outcasts, imprisoned in a desolate wasteland called the Blight, who band together to escape. His father had once read a draft and asked him what, exactly, he was trying to write. Ethan had replied that he was just writing for fun. His father sighed, urging him to get a real job, and Ethan, as always, had cheerfully agreed and then promptly ignored the advice. The manuscript was less than halfway finished when the dying Arbiter pulled him from his sleep and into this world. The Arbiter explained that he had severely disrupted the tapestry of reality. It said that the demons of the Blight were now stirring, just as he had written, intending to escape and wreak havoc upon the world. The dagger it had thrown down pulsed again with a faint, chilling blue light, drawing Ethan's gaze. He was told he must use that dagger to kill Julian Astor, the one leading the rebellion. Ethan was stunned for a moment, then laughed. He asked the Arbiter if it hadn't made some kind of mistake. He pulled up his sleeve, revealing his right hand. It was severed cleanly at the wrist, replaced by a prosthesis carved from linden wood. Ethan displayed his own brokenness without shame, questioning how a man like him was supposed to do anything but get himself killed. He remembered precisely how he had written Julian Astor's power levels. Julian was a primordial entity born of the world's raw energy, with a temperament as cold and unforgiving as a winter mountain. He held no life sacred. Someone had once offended him. Julian, in between casual remarks, had flayed the skin from the man's back, extracted his spine whole, ground it into dust, and fired it into a teacup he then used for his daily brew. The arbiter coughed twice before speaking slowly, explaining that there was only one person in the world Julian would never harm. It would lend him that person's form. Ethan found this even more ridiculous, asking why that person couldn't just kill Julian himself. The arbiter replied that the man was Julian's mentor, because Julian had been so monstrous, massacring his peers, stealing sacred artifacts. His mentor had been judged complicit for failing to guide him. He had been stripped of his power, cast out, and had already died as a mortal in the outside world. Seeing Ethan's silence, the arbiter pressed him, asking what he thought. Ethan answered bluntly that he thought it was a terrible idea. This time, it was the arbiter's turn to fall silent. After a long moment, a powerful force struck Ethan. He felt his body go light, tipping backward. The white light vanished, and a rush of wind swept past the back of his head. He had no time to react before he was once again plunging into a deep, dark void. As he fell, the arbiter's voice grew more distant, but its weak words struck him like the tolling of a great bell. It warned him that if he couldn't kill Julian, he would remain in the blight for eternity. Ethan summoned all his strength to curse the arbiter's very existence. He didn't know how long he fell. A numbness spread through his chest before his body finally landed in something soft. He couldn't get up. He roughly estimated he'd been airborne for at least half an hour, passing through a series of colossal, crumbling gates. Ribbons of dazzling, kaleidoscopic light had swirled around him, leaving his vision blurred and spotted. When he first landed, he could neither hear nor see, forced to lie flat. Suddenly, a flood of chaotic information rushed into his mind. He processed it for a moment before letting out a soft sound of surprise. The fragments flooding his consciousness seemed to belong to Julian's mentor, but strangely, the man shared his last name, Vance. His first name was also Ethan. The memories were a jumbled mess, containing only basic information. After sorting through them for some time, Ethan could only piece together a few key points. This Ethan Vance had been the top student at Ethelgard, a sanctum for celestial guardians. Julian Astor was a child Ethan had found and brought back to the academy, and Julian had followed him ever since. Julian had seemed weak, often bullied, and would likely have been tormented to death by the other disciples if Ethan hadn't protected him. However, Julian's true nature was that of a primordial demon. His power was immense and unpredictable. He had feigned weakness, hiding within Ethelgard for years, waiting for a chance to seize the powerful artifacts housed within the 4 great sanctums. For years, he had carefully cultivated connections, using both overt and covert schemes to subvert a score of righteous disciples to his cause. However, just as he was about to succeed, his plot was exposed. On New Year's Eve, he murdered his own master. Through a cruel twist of fate, Ethan Vance had taken the blame for the crime and was unjustly imprisoned and tortured. Later, during the purges, Julian and several other traitors were exiled to the Blight, an inescapable prison, a hell outside of the world. Ethan, considered his accomplice, was stripped of his power and cast out to die as a mortal. And to kill Julian Astor, the task was deceptively simple. He just had to take the dagger, infused with celestial energy, and plunge it into the crimson mark at the center of Julian's forehead. That would end his life. Ethan lay on the ground in despair, thinking, damn it, I don't remember writing all this backstory. He had no interest in epic romances or celestial politics. He had simply wanted to write a story with a villain as the protagonist, something different from the usual fare. He hadn't even bothered to create a detailed history for his Julian Astor. And now, it seemed his story and the Julian of this world had unexpectedly converged. It was like two strings on an instrument previously separate, but his plucking of one had caused the other to vibrate, disrupting the order of this world. And it was precisely because he and the mortal, powerless Ethan Vance were both ordinary humans that the so-called Arbiter of Worlds had summoned him to eliminate Julian. Ethan, now effectively the other Ethan Vance, slowly recovered his senses. He pushed himself up and his hand brushed against something round. He looked down and saw it was a human head. He scrambled to his feet, horrified to discover that the area for a mile around was littered with corpses and skeletons, most of them torn to shreds, their insides scattered across the ground. The moment he saw the bodies, his sense of smell returned with a vengeance. The stench stabbed at his brain, and his stomach churned violently. Fortunately, he'd once spent 3 days and nights in a morgue on a $100 bet, eating and sleeping alongside the old caretaker. He wasn't afraid of corpses, but he had never seen bodies this thoroughly dismembered. The sight was a profound shock. He fought back the nausea, carefully picking his way through the gaps between the bodies, desperate to escape the killing field. He tried not to look too closely at the gruesome remains, but soon he stopped short, crouching beside one of the corpses. A moment later, he shot back to his feet and broke into a dead run. He had realized the tears in the flesh were not from animal bites. They were human teeth marks. In other words, this field of bodies was someone's kitchen in the blight. Ethan felt that if he didn't get away quickly, he'd be the next meal on the menu. But in this vast, desolate wasteland, where was he supposed to find Julian Astor? As he pondered this, a roar shattered the silence. He spun around to see a horrifying humanoid monster charging madly toward him. Aside from its arms, which were 2 razor-sharp blades, the monster's body was relatively normal from the neck down. But its face looked as if it had been torn off and hastily slapped back on. Its nose was on its forehead, one eye was where its mouth should have been, and the other grew out of its neck. It looked like a giant, grotesque candle that had melted and deformed. It crashed through the sea of corpses, sending up sprays of gore, and charged straight for him. Ethan cursed and took off, stumbling over the carnage. Once on clear ground, he picked a random direction and sprinted. It was clear the monster wasn't just trying to chase him out of its territory. Ethan had already run for nearly a mile, and it was still hot on his heels, the distance between them closing. He was gasping for breath, constantly glancing over his shoulder. In his peripheral vision, he caught sight of another figure, a charred, skeletal human form, emerging from the side and stumbling towards him. Targeted by 2 monsters at once, exhausted and desperate, Ethan thought he might as well just pick one to eat him. At least that way he'd die with some agency. He didn't notice that the monster behind him had slowed its pace. Its misplaced features twitched, its gaze fixed on the thin, blackened figure. It was a look of horror and rage, as if seeing something terrifying. After a moment, as if making a decision, it let out a low growl and changed its target, lunging toward the charred man. In that split second, Ethan had already chosen the charred figure as his preferred doom. If the creature behind him caught him, he'd be skewered on its blades and left in pieces among the other corpses. The thought was too grim to bear. He had just taken 2 steps toward the charred man when their eyes met. He wasn't sure if it was a hallucination, but in the empty sockets of the man's burned skull, a faint light seemed to flicker. It held panic, concern, and a tenderness Ethan couldn't comprehend. The man opened his mouth, and charred fragments crumbled from his jaw as he spoke. He told Ethan to run. Ethan skidded to a halt. It was a human voice. Though hoarse and distorted by the fire, he realized it belonged to a conscious, thinking person. A prisoner exiled to the Blight? Badly injured? While thinking, Ethan abandoned his plan to offer himself up and bolted in a new direction. The burned man was clearly weak. In just a few moments, Ethan had left him far behind. He staggered a few steps after Ethan's retreating figure, calling out again for him to run. Then he stopped, turned, and faced the razor-bladed monster charging violently toward him. His lips parted slightly. His silhouette looked desolate, yet the set of his remaining facial muscles suggested a cold smile. Unlike the gentleness he had shown Ethan, he now lifted his chin slightly, facing the monster like an elegant, powerful panther observing a yapping dog. Just as Ethan couldn't see the monster's expression now, the monster couldn't see what Ethan was doing. Hearing no footsteps behind him, Ethan stopped and looked back. The charred man stood with his back to him, facing the monster, seemingly sacrificing himself to buy Ethan time. His figure looked tragic and so frail that a gust of wind could have blown him over. Ethan gritted his teeth. A dagger was tucked neatly at his waist, likely placed there by the arbiter before he was pushed. He drew it with his left hand, concealed it behind his back, and walked straight toward the monster. As he passed the charred figure, he didn't pause but instead quickened his pace. The dark figure was stunned, managing to call out a single word that sounded like mentor. Ethan was already running. The wind roared in his ears, drowning out the call, so he didn't hear what he had been called. The monster had locked onto the charred man, but when its escaped prey returned, it roared in fury. It raised its bladed left arm and stabbed through the air toward Ethan, aiming to finish him quickly. Ethan raised his right hand to block. There was a dull thud of something being pierced. Ethan looked at his lindenwood palm, which now had a hole clean through it, and whistled a jaunty tune. Before the monster could react, he kicked out, pinning its other blade arm to the ground. With all his strength, he leveraged his impaled right hand upward, raising the monster's left arm. The dagger, the one meant for Julian Astor's heart, sank into the monster's. Ethan quickly pulled the dagger free and leaped back. The monster collapsed, convulsing, splattered with blood. Ethan fought down his revulsion and rushed forward. He stomped on the monster's arm and plunged the blood-soaked dagger into its forehead. After a final series of spasms, the creature went still. Before the tension in his muscles could ease, he heard a heavy thud behind him. He turned to find the charred man had collapsed. His heart lurched. He ran to him, cradling him in his arms. He called out to him. The man weakly told him to go 20 miles southeast, to take him there. With that, he slumped over, seemingly unconscious. Faced with this complete stranger, Ethan barely hesitated. He picked up the dagger, wiped it carelessly on his shirt, and, ignoring the man's filthy condition, carefully lifted him onto his back. He painstakingly used his good left hand and his damaged right one to secure the man's arms around his neck. Once he was sure he had a stable hold, Ethan started walking southeast. There were probably companions of this man in that direction. If he could get him there, he'd have earned a massive favor. He could ask them about Julian Astor's whereabouts then. He might even run into him there. His father and sister were at home, and if he was gone too long, they would surely worry. He had to get home soon. Lost in his thoughts, Ethan didn't notice the charred figure on his back open his eyes. He nestled contentedly against Ethan's back, silently whispering a name. The 20-mile journey had to be made on foot, carrying a person no less, so progress was slow. Fortunately, the man wasn't heavy. Probably because he was burned down to a husk, he was surprisingly light to carry. The path was strangely clean. Not even a snake or an insect could be seen. And their destination was conspicuous. Even from 20 miles away, Ethan could see a colossal tower rising in the southeast. It pierced the sky, its surface shimmering with a golden light. As far as he could see, it was the only sign of man-made construction. Even without the man's directions, Ethan would have headed there. There was no daylight in the blight. The sky was a heavy, oppressive ceiling, like a cataract over an old man's eye. It must have rained recently. The air was damp and the light dim. The forest was dense, a rolling tide of green. Ethan trudged through the woods with a dying man on his back. The silence was unnerving, so profound it made his skin crawl. To break it, he started whistling. The sound was clear and sharp, seeming to seep into the wet rocks. He whistled an old folk tune smoothly from start to finish, then genuinely praised himself for how good it sounded. The person on his back shifted slightly, and a puff of warm air touched his neck, as if in laughter. But when Ethan turned his head, the man's head was resting quietly against his back, motionless. It must have been his imagination. After passing through the forest, rugged hills began to appear. Ethan's legs were aching, and he was exhausted. He found a dry cave and ducked inside. There was a moss-covered rock inside. Ethan tried to set the man down against it, but he found the man's arms had gone rigid, wrapped around his neck with just enough space for him to breathe. Trying to put him down was more likely to get him strangled. Feeling helpless, Ethan didn't dare pat him, afraid a slight jolt might break one of his brittle limbs. He tried waking him, asking if he was conscious. The body behind him stirred. Ethan told him they were resting for a while and asked him to let go. The person behind him painstakingly loosened his grip, just a little, but didn't truly let go, instead clutching the corner of Ethan's shirt. His voice was still a terrifying, fire-ravaged rasp. He asked if Ethan was going to leave. Despite the horrifying face, Ethan felt surprisingly calm. For one, he had just fought that monster and been showered in its blood. Everything seemed peaceful in comparison now. For another, in a wasteland teeming with monsters, a creature that at least retained a human shape wasn't so frightening. Ethan settled the man against the rock, then carefully took off his own jacket and wrapped it around him, assuring him he wasn't leaving. The man's hollow eyes stared at Ethan as he weakly asked why he had saved him. Ethan tucked the jacket in for him. He murmured that there wasn't always a reason. What if he had died on his back? The man whispered. Ethan found it amusing. He'd carry him home, of course, he said. He wasn't about to just dump him on the side of the road. With that, he stood up, saying there was a river outside and he was going to get some water. He warned him not to pull off the jacket, or he'd tear his skin and shouldn't cry about it. The man clutched the jacket like a small child, whispering that it didn't hurt. Once Ethan was gone, he grabbed Ethan's sleeve and inhaled its scent greedily. Pieces of his burned flesh flaked off with the movement, but he seemed completely oblivious to the pain. He whispered the same name over and over again. Ethan went out of the cave and knelt by the river. A sense of unreality still clung to him. He knelt down, trying to wash the blood from his hands, but the more he washed, the thicker the smell of blood seemed to become, until it was unbearable. His knees suddenly gave way, and he retched over the riverbank several times, though nothing came up. He wiped his mouth, lay back on the bank, and stared up at the sickly green sky. He felt for his waist. The so-called spirit-infused dagger was still there, a reminder of his unfinished mission. He didn't notice that, several yards away in the woods, a snake's head the size of a dinner plate slowly emerged. Only the head was intact. Its body was a skeleton, held together by frayed strands of rotting flesh. It flicked its forked tongue silently in Ethan's direction, then worked its jaw. Its mouth opened wide enough to bite off Ethan's head whole. Ethan lay there, oblivious, lost in a daze. The snake crept closer, but stopped about 10 feet away. A moment later, as if catching a terrifying scent, it turned and fled frantically. Its bones scraped against the gray earth with a sharp, grating sound. Ethan heard the strange noise. He immediately reached for his dagger, rolled over, and looked behind him. There was nothing there but a strange trail winding to the edge of the woods and disappearing. Ethan decided this was not a place to linger. He quickly plucked a broad leaf from a tree by the river, washed it, rolled it into a simple cup, and filled it with water. As he did, he happened to catch his reflection in the water's surface. Even knowing the dangers of this place, he couldn't help but stare for a moment. The face was undeniably handsome, with a tall, slender build and the air of a noble swordsman. His features were still when at rest, but animated with a dynamic charisma when he moved. Every part of his face, eyes, brows, nose, mouth, fit the word beautiful. Perhaps because of his refined and solemn temperament, a single teardrop-shaped mark rested just beneath his left eye. When Ethan put on a stern expression, he could even see a hint of ascetic coolness. He thought it was a cosmic joke that fate had given this face to a sarcastic loudmouth like him. While Ethan was marveling at this, the great snake that had retreated into the woods was writhing on the ground in silent agony. Its joints were being snapped one by some strange, unseen force, the sounds as crisp as a breaking stalk of grass. When Ethan returned to the cave, he found the charred man sitting up, fiddling with a dry blade of grass. He had already snapped it in several places, starting from the end. He was counting as he broke it, whispering numbers under his breath. Seeing Ethan return, he quickly hid his hands behind his back and looked up at him, an image of mysterious obedience. Seeing he had some energy, Ethan gave him a drink of water and then urged him to get moving, saying something about this place felt wrong. The dark figure nodded. He put down the mangled blade of grass and held out his arms. The meaning was clear. He wanted to be carried. Ethan sized him up, telling him he didn't look that badly hurt and should try walking on his own. The dark figure didn't move, just tilted his head up at Ethan. Ethan stared back for a few seconds, unmoved, and told him to get up. The dark figure kept his arms outstretched, his chin slightly tucked, looking utterly aggrieved. Ethan held his ground for another moment, facing the featureless, charred face, before his brow furrowed in annoyance with a soft sound of frustration. When they left the cave, the dark figure was once again on Ethan's back, wrapped in his coat. Ethan rolled up his pant legs and waded across the river, while the dark figure looked back toward the dense forest and gave a chilling smile. The bone snake lay twisted in the woods, its skeleton mangled into a pulp, the ground around it scarred with signs of a desperate struggle. It lay among the weeds, long dead. A swarm of ants, each the size of a bean, poured from their nest and devoured the bone snake in minutes. Strangely, when they came across the footprints Ethan had left in the woods, they scurried away as if from a plague, making a wide detour as if a terrifying beast had just passed through. Walking for 20 miles without a word was bound to get boring. After spending most of the journey trying to organize the original Ethan's memories, he found they were mostly scattered, trivial details. There wasn't a single complete fragment. Even Julian Astor's face was a blur. At first, Ethan found it strange, but on second thought, it made sense. These were memories stripped from a dead man. It was no surprise they were incomplete. The only thing he knew for sure was that Julian had a crimson mark in the center of his forehead. To kill him, he had to strike there. With nothing better to do, Ethan struck up a conversation with the person on his back, asking how he got injured. The man answered in his raspy voice that he'd been ambushed. Ethan then asked how long he'd been in the blight. He said he couldn't remember, that it felt like 100 years. Ethan took it as a joke and got straight to the point, asking if he knew Julian Astor. The dark figure was silent for a moment, then asked why he was looking for him. Ethan, sensing an opportunity, was thrilled. He replied that Julian was his student. The dark figure was about to say something when a distant explosion of noise reached them both. A wave of heat and energy rolled over them, nearly knocking Ethan off his feet. The sound had come from the direction of the giant tower. The dark figure showed a rare flicker of anxiety, pushing Ethan's shoulder. He urged him to hurry, to go there. Normally, Ethan would have turned and run in the opposite direction as fast as he could, avoiding trouble at all costs. But the thought that Julian might be there made him grit his teeth and sprint toward the tower. The closer he got to the center of the battle, the more agitated the person on his back became. And likewise, the closer he got to the tower, the more an inexplicable pressure made it hard for him to breathe. The first thing that came into view was a young man standing on a cliff edge. A terrifying iron half-mask covered the upper part of his face. He stood high above, his black clothes fluttering like a crow's wings, a faint purple light spinning in his palm. A small crow, though. Ethan recognized this person. He had also appeared in his manuscript. He was one of Julian's subordinates, a necromancer skilled in commanding ghosts. But Ethan had never gotten around to giving him a name. In fact, in the entire manuscript, only Julian had a name. In Ethan's world building, there were 4 paths of power: human adepts, fae, necromancers, and warlocks. Only human adepts were considered righteous, with the power to rule all realms. The fae were born of nature's essence, spirits of plants and animals. Necromancers operated on the principle that all life returns to the earth, commanding both ghosts and corpses. As for adepts and warlocks, both were human, but they walked different paths. Adepts cultivated their spirit through discipline and harmony with nature. Warlocks cultivated their physical form through raw, chaotic power that often drove them mad. And those trapped in the blight were, without exception, fae, warlocks, necromancers, and fallen adepts. Ethan looked out and saw several tattered ghosts darting through the air like shuttles, each wielding a weapon and fighting furiously. A faint purple sigil, the same color as the light in the masked youth's palm, glowed on each of their foreheads. The masked youth was a conspicuous target. Soon, an arrow aimed at his chest flew like a lightning strike. When it was still 10 feet away, a 9-foot spear with a swirling tassel suddenly appeared before him, meeting the arrow tip. The 2 points collided with a crackle of energy, and the spearhead split the arrow clean in 2. Then, a shimmering phantom materialized in front of the masked youth, gradually taking solid form. The figure grabbed the end of the spear and, with a flick of his wrist, spun it in a perfect, glowing arc. He was an incredibly handsome young man, though unfortunately, he too had a faint purple sigil on his forehead, marking him as another spirit. He momentarily abandoned the fierce battle below and turned to the small, masked youth, leaning down to plant a kiss on the tip of his mask. He said with a grin that he was being careless and should learn to dodge. The masked youth was stunned, then flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He told Beckett to get back down there. With a pinch of his fingers, A purple light glowed. The spear-wielding young man fell from the cliff, stumbling in midair before regaining his footing. The masked youth touched the tip of his nose, biting his full lip with a pout, clearly sulking. Ethan heard the dark figure on his back let out a heartfelt sigh of relief. Ethan asked him what they should do now. The dark figure looked up at the sky and let out a sharp whistle. Ethan didn't know what he was doing and was about to ask when a skeleton suddenly emerged from behind a large rock, startling him so much he nearly choked. It was a female skeleton, perfectly clean, without a shred of flesh, but with a full head of dark, lustrous hair, neatly coiled and tied with a long, pale blue ribbon. Her first glance fell on the charred man, and she expressed her surprise, asking how he had gotten into such a state just from going for a walk. The dark figure didn't answer, only asking coldly what was happening. The skeleton woman, Celeste, reached out a bony right hand and placed it on the charred man's wrist, explaining that it was the faction from the sealed mountain. The dark figure sneered, calling them overconfident. Celeste's bones began to glow with a faint green light, sending waves of energy into the charred man's body. She told him not to worry, that she would heal him. Even if he hadn't returned, Caleb and Beckett could have won. Hearing this, Ethan felt something was off, but the clash of weapons and screams of battle distracted him. He peeked out from their hiding spot. In the melee, it was hard to tell friend from foe. Everyone was dressed in rags, their faces gaunt. The only standout was a girl who looked about 13 or 14. She was incredibly thin. Her brown tunic was torn to shreds, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, revealing slender wrists as white as snow. In stark contrast, she wielded a battle blade in each hand. The bronze blades, if stood on end, would have been nearly as tall as her, yet she swung them effortlessly with one hand, cleaving an enemy's neck in a single leap. Her face was streaked with blood, making her look even more pale and delicate. Just as Celeste had said, the attackers soon fell back like a receding tide, retreating in disarray. The girl sheathed her blades in a cross pattern on her back and was about to give chase. In a moment of urgency, Ethan stepped out from his hiding place and shouted for her not to pursue them. The battle was in a valley, so his voice echoed, layer upon layer. The girl turned at the sound, looking at the strange man with surprise, tilting her head. The masked youth on the cliff also looked over, the purple light in his palm vanishing. The talisman he was using to control the ghosts fluttered to the ground. He murmured a name, asking if it was Ethan. The girl, unafraid, called out, asking why they shouldn't give chase when they were clearly on the run. Ethan pointed in the direction they had fled, explaining that their banners hadn't fallen and their formation was intact as they retreated. He asked her if she had ever seen such an orderly retreat. The girl was taken aback, unsure whether to pursue or not. Just then, Celeste, who had been healing the dark figure, stared at Ethan in a daze, her skeleton trembling. A cool, commanding voice came from behind Ethan, telling her to listen to him. Ethan turned to see a stunning sight. The dark figure's burnt body was unfurling. The desiccated husk rapidly expanded, and his height soon surpassed Ethan's. Like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, he shed the charred, ruined shell, revealing his true form. His skin was incredibly pale, so white it seemed to glow faintly. He embodied a languid, almost lazy grace that was captivating rather than off-putting. The corners of his eyes tilted upward slightly, tinged with a natural crimson hue at the tips. He had wrapped Ethan's coat around himself, but the makeshift garment was more alluring than being naked, failing to conceal anything of importance. Ethan glanced at his face for only a moment before his gaze was drawn downward. This person looked like a beautiful woman, but what lay beneath the coat was larger than his own. After a long moment of stunned thought, Ethan realized he had missed something crucial. At the center of the man's forehead was a single, perfect crimson mark. Ethan looked up and met a pair of almond-shaped eyes. The owner of those eyes and that mark stared at him intently. His gaze was like a deep pool, both alluring and possessive, as if he wanted to drown the person before him. He said that he, Julian, had waited so many years, and finally his mentor had come for him. The realization that Julian Astor had been the one clinging to his back sent a chill down Ethan's spine. More importantly, he had no idea how to respond. First, these people clearly knew Ethan Vance, and he didn't know what the real Ethan was like in their presence. Second, he was clueless about the history between Julian and Ethan. Logically, since Julian had murdered their master and indirectly caused Ethan to be cast out, Ethan should hate him. He was saved from the awkward silence by an 8-foot spear. As he hesitated, a sharp, cold light swept toward him, the tip aimed directly at his chest. Ethan instinctively raised his hands and took a step back, blurting out a surprised, "Whoa." The word was out before he could stop it. Back when he was just Ethan Vance the writer, he had a habit of making flippant remarks. If the original Ethan wasn't such a wisecracker, he might have just blown his cover. In the span of a few thoughts, Ethan heard a sharp crack. The spectral spear was snapped in two right before his eyes. The tip flew upward, the shaft split, revealing a clean, white break. Julian's left hand was clamped around the break point. His eyes were fixed on the young man who had attacked. His tone was devoid of emotion as he told Beckett to stand down. The young man named Beckett, holding the broken spear, did not retreat an inch. The threat was useless. Julian showed no mercy. He snapped off the spearhead and threw it at Beckett. Beckett dodged, but it still sliced a deep gush across his neck, blood pouring out. As a spirit controlled by a necromancer, ordinary weapons couldn't harm him. Only spectral arms could damage his form. The spearhead embedded itself in a large rock behind him, shattering it like tofu. Julian's voice was low and dangerous. He warned him not to point that thing at his mentor. Beckett was fearless. He flipped the broken shaft and used it to lift Ethan's chin, asking Julian if he really believed this was Ethan Vance. He asked if any of them believed it. Seeing no one respond and the situation turning awkward, Ethan shamelessly raised his hand and said he believed it. Beckett sneered, questioning his credibility, suggesting he was probably just one of the lamplighters' reanimated corpses. In his world, Ethan had read countless obscure books and recalled a passage about waking corpses in a collection of folklore. A waking corpse was a monster created from a dead body. Its appearance and behavior were indistinguishable from a normal person. It could even think, live, and eat like one. But a waking corpse had lost all of its former emotions. It couldn't distinguish love from hate, right from wrong, light from dark, or hot from cold. It would act solely on its master's commands. Beckett wasted no more words. He lowered the spear and summoned a ball of ghost fire in his left hand, thrusting it toward Ethan's face. The flame stopped just 3 inches from Ethan's eyes. The ghost fire was chillingly cold, not burning, but the bone-deep cold still coated his face in a layer of frost. To maintain the image of the original Ethan, which he was already ruining, he forced himself not to blink, watching as frost formed on his eyelashes. As the flame burned, Beckett's confident expression began to waver. A true waking corpse would have mistaken the cold flame for a searing fire and instinctively recoiled in fear. He stared at Ethan in disbelief, asking how it was possible. He asked if he wasn't a waking corpse. Ethan was speechless. He stood with his hands behind his back, looking at Beckett with a profound but utterly feigned confidence. Beckett waved his hand, and the ghost fire dissipated into 1,000 blue sparks. But his face was still clouded with suspicion. He told Julian to give him his weapon. He said a fight would reveal the truth. Ethan had to remind him that he was now a mortal. Beckett, of course, didn't believe him, asking if he meant his powers had been stripped. Ethan neither confirmed nor denied it. Beckett sneered, saying it was impossible. From what he knew, no one survived having their core power removed. Ethan replied that was only what he knew. Beckett stopped arguing and reached for his arm. Before he could touch him, Julian grabbed Ethan's right wrist. The grip was so strong Ethan nearly stumbled. Julian pulled Ethan behind him, his voice laced with a terrifying coldness. He said that if he were a waking corpse daring to use his mentor's face, he would have strangled him the moment they met. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, thinking, who raised this kid? So rude. He'd kindly carried him home, and this was his thanks. But then he remembered his own mission and shut up. He was no saint either. The pot shouldn't call the kettle black. Julian paused, then continued, saying his mentor had indeed lost his powers, something he had tested on their way there. His spiritual channels had been dormant for a long time, with no energy flowing. With that, he turned his face, his voice instantly softening. He asked if that was right, mentor. If he didn't have to play the part of the betrayed senior. If he didn't know the man before him was a mass-murdering demon. And if he wasn't here to kill him, Ethan might have found the kid quite endearing. He resisted the urge to pat his head and turned away. Julian sensed his rejection, and his eyes dimmed. He looked as dejected as a puppy denied a pat from its owner. Beckett seemed somewhat convinced, but his doubts remained. He asked if he could be sure he wasn't an imposter. Even Celeste looked like she couldn't take it anymore, murmuring Beckett's name. Beckett thought for a moment, his brow raising as if he'd thought of a perfect test. Ethan noticed the change in his expression and braced himself for the next challenge. Beckett said that from childhood, he had given him over a dozen nicknames. If he could name 3, he would believe he was Ethan Vance. Nicknames, over a dozen of them. Ethan thought the original mentor didn't seem like a very serious person either. However, a check of his fragmented memories confirmed that the original Ethan had indeed done something so childish. There were 4 great sanctums. Ethan and Julian were from Ethelgard. Beckett was the son of the Lord of Havenfall Isle. The other 2 were Sunstone Peak and Serene Valley. The original's memories were extremely fragmented. Ethan could only tell from scattered pieces that whenever he and Beckett met, they would bicker and fight. Their relationship was terrible, which was why Ethan had given him so many nicknames to signify Beckett's special place in his heart. Ethan paused for a moment, successfully pulling a nickname from the fragments. He said Bex, then Pumpkin, finally Oh and Chubby Beckett. Beckett couldn't take it anymore and yelled at him to shut up. The twin-bladed girl, Willow, burst out laughing. Beckett, mortified, turned and scolded her for laughing. She wasn't afraid at all, asking her uncle how Chubby Beckett made any sense. Ethan peeked out from behind Julian and helpfully explained that it was because he weighed over 150 pounds when he was 11. Beckett's face turned beet red. He threw the remaining half of his spear shaft on the ground, yelling at Ethan and asking if he wanted a beating. Ethan shamelessly hid behind Julian and played dead. As they were speaking, a dark figure ran over from the distance. It was the masked youth from the cliff. Before Ethan could react, the youth crashed into his arms, his voice thick with tears. He called him Mentor. The youth was indeed short, only reaching Ethan's chin. The lower half of his face, not covered by the terrifying iron mask, was delicate and fair. At a glance, he looked like a child. Ethan was taken aback by the hug. Operating on the principle of if you don't know their name, just act familiar, he patted the youth's hair and confirmed it was him. The youth looked up. The eyes behind the mask were a pale green, round and bright, like a young fox's. He asked where his mentor had been for 13 years. Ethan gave a wry smile, thinking, "Hold on, let me make something up." But before he could, Beckett pulled the youth out of his embrace. Ethan wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but Beckett's expression seemed even darker than before. He pointed to the broken spear on the ground and said to the youth, Leo, with cold indifference, to fix it. Leo struggled, saying his mentor was here and he had to talk to him first. Beckett glanced at Julian, then harshly dragged Leo away, telling him it wasn't his turn to speak to him yet. Leo seemed to understand and fell silent. Julian didn't bother with pleasantries either. He grabbed Ethan's wrist and led him directly into the tower. Ethan tried to pull away, but he wasn't strong enough and was dragged along like a dog. In his haste, he glanced back and saw Celeste, the skeleton who had healed Julian, staring at him. When their eyes met, she quickly looked down and turned to leave. The pale blue ribbon in her dark hair, reaching her waist, fluttered like a wave as she walked away. After they entered the tower, the twin-bladed girl, Willow, approached the masked youth, Leo, and asked curiously if that was the mentor they always talked about. Leo, fiddling with the broken spear, was overjoyed and confirmed it was. Willow scratched her messy, short hair, saying she thought he seemed rather frivolous. Leo replied that while his mentor could be a bit reckless, he was the best person in the world. Hearing this, Beckett rolled his eyes with a scoff. Leo turned to Beckett, complaining about his laughing and asking if he knew how much energy it took to repair a spectral weapon, telling him to be more careful. Beckett conceded. Then he turned to the girl, asking where Caleb and his wife were. Willow replied that they'd heard about some spirit stones found in the southern mountains and had gone to look, and would probably be back around midnight. Beckett thought for a moment, then pulled Willow aside, asking seriously if she would do her uncle a favor. Willow leaned in, and Beckett whispered his instructions. The masked youth nearby looked up sharply, asking Beckett if he still suspected their mentor. Beckett retorted, asking why he was eavesdropping. Leo said indignantly that he was his spectral servant. His eyes were his eyes, and his ears were his ears, and did he think he wanted to listen? Beckett sighed and spoke openly. He said it had been 13 years, and Ethan Vance suddenly appearing out of nowhere was too suspicious. He warned him not to forget that the lamplighter had always wanted them dead. As he spoke, he looked at the tower's bronze doors, his voice cold. He added, especially Julian, surviving in the blight for 13 years without dying. He had probably become the lamplighter's greatest obsession. Inside the tower, it was a world apart from the desolation outside. The interior was elegant and serene. A stream of fresh water even meandered through it, with smooth stones and painted walls. Reflections shimmered on the walls, and a gentle mist filled the air. Ethan felt as if he had stepped into a hidden paradise, and he was the clumsy fisherman who had stumbled upon it. Julian waved his hand, and a bamboo door opposite the main entrance swung open. He led Ethan inside. The room was fully furnished with a table, chairs, and a bed, even decorated with pearls and fine silks. Julian spoke softly, telling his mentor that this was his room, which he had long prepared for him. He said he had arranged everything just as it used to be, though some things were impossible to find in the blight. He told him not to be angry, that he would find every last thing for him in the future. Ethan feigned indifference with a grunt. Julian pulled him to sit on the edge of the bed, his eyes shining with a strange light. He mentioned that his mentor had touched Leo's hair and asked if he would touch his hair too. Great, Ethan thought, the masked kid's name is Leo. Now he wouldn't have to worry about what to call him next time. He looked around, not directly at Julian, nor did he answer his question. As he scanned the room, he noticed a beautifully crafted bamboo fan resting on the headboard. It looked intriguing. He picked it up with his left hand and slowly unfolded it. On its surface were 8 bold, calligraphic words. "In all the world, who is there but me?" The signature read, "Number 1 under heaven, Ethan Vance of Ethelgard." Julian, having been ignored, sidled up to him again, a picture of obedience. He asked if his mentor liked that he had kept his signature weapon safe. Ethan thought the original owner's taste was a complete mystery. He tried to put the fan back, but as his hand touched the bed, a vine shot out from the foot of the bed like lightning, wrapping tightly around his left wrist. Ethan was shocked, asking what it was. Julian was delighted, exclaiming that his mentor was finally speaking to him. Ethan told him fine, he would talk, just get this thing off him. But the vine, as thick as a child's arm, showed no sign of loosening. Julian asked hopefully if his mentor hadn't said, when he carried him back, that he had come to the blight just to find him. He was here now, he said, so his mentor shouldn't go anywhere. Seeing Ethan's continued silence, Julian's disappointment was palpable. He stood up, saying if his mentor truly wouldn't speak to him, he would wait a little longer. As he saw him actually about to leave, Ethan urgently shouted for him to let him go. Julian, who had reached the door, was startled by Ethan's sharp tone. When he turned back, his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He asked his mentor to be patient for a little while, saying that everything he was doing now was for his own good. The blight was too dangerous. As long as he stayed by Julian's side, he would be safe. He begged him to agree to stay. If he weren't currently bound and helpless, anyone seeing Julian's pitiful expression would think he was the one being held captive. Ethan held onto a last shred of hope, telling him to let him go and he wouldn't go anywhere. Julian thought for a moment and asked if his mentor didn't like the vine. Ethan nodded. The vine might attract bugs, and he was terrified of them. Julian reluctantly agreed. Soon he had left again, closing the door behind him. Ethan leaned back against the headboard, feeling utterly hopeless. The vine on his left wrist had transformed into a heavy, ornate golden shackle. He touched the dagger at his waist with his wooden hand, feeling a deep sense of despair. This was what they called being defeated before the battle even began. After carrying someone for 20 miles, he was truly exhausted. He wound the chain around his arm, settled in, and went to sleep. With his prosthetic hand, even holding chopsticks was a chore. A delicate task like assassination would have to wait for another opportunity. After Ethan fell asleep, the bamboo door opened silently again. Julian paced in from outside. He had changed into a simple, white linen robe, its cross-collar embroidered with dragon and cloud patterns. The back was adorned with an inkwash design. His hair was held by an elegant cap tied with a pale blue ribbon that made his dark hair seem like ink. But he still wore the same outer robe, stained with soot and blood. He knelt silently by the bed, took Ethan's right hand, and rested his cheek on it, gazing at the sleeping man. Julian's eyes carefully traced the firm line of his lips, the curve of his throat, the rise and fall of his chest. His expression a mix of nervousness, apprehension, and fear, as if he were looking at a priceless vase that might shatter at any moment. He watched for an unknown length of time, as if he couldn't believe Ethan was truly alive. His fingers slowly moved to Ethan's chest, pushing aside the thin layer of clothing. His fingertips rested over his heart, feeling the strong, steady beat beneath the skin. Thump, 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 thump. A look of deep satisfaction and emotion washed over Julian's face. He whispered that his mentor was back, that he was home. As he murmured, his breathing grew ragged. Bloodshot veins appeared in his eyes, and his normally clear pupils were slowly stained crimson. The marks at the corners of his eyes and on his forehead pulsed with a terrifying red light. His fingers trembled violently, his nails elongating, on the verge of tearing through the skin over Ethan's heart. Julian fought for control, swiftly pulling his hand back and digging his fingers into his own wrist. 5 deep, bone-deep gashes appeared, and only after seeing blood did the red in his eyes begin to recede. Ethan's eyelids twitched, as if sensing something. Julian couldn't stay any longer. He sealed his own energy flow and, with his last shred of sanity, removed his outer robe and draped it over Ethan before turning to leave. The moment he stepped out the door, Julian nearly collided with someone. Willow frowned, reaching out to steady him. She asked if he was all right. Julian pushed her hand away. Gasping for breath, he asked in a cold voice what she wanted. Willow was used to Julian's episodes. She knew that when he lost control, he would go on a rampage that only blood could quell. Fortunately, even in his most frenzied state, he never harmed them, so she wasn't afraid. She answered briskly that it was her first time meeting his mentor and she wanted to talk to him. Julian pressed a hand to his wildly beating heart and told her that his mentor was sleeping, so she should wait outside until he woke up. Willow saluted and agreed. After watching Julian stumble out of the tower's bronze doors, Willow turned back, whistled softly, and pushed the door open to go inside. The sound of the door woke Ethan. As he sat up, the robe draped over him slipped off. He was naturally cold-blooded. He had forgotten to cover himself before sleeping, and his shirt had somehow come open. After that nap, his hands and feet were like ice. He shivered. Before he could wonder who had covered him, he pulled the still warm robe into his arms for warmth. Willow asked if he was cold. Ethan admitted he was, rubbing his palms together as he studied her. She had taken off the 2 giant blades and was wearing a coarse red tunic. But with her ruby lips and snowy skin, she had a kind of disheveled beauty. Noticing his gaze, Willow laughed, saying her uncle was right. Ethan was confused. Willow crossed her arms, smiling, and quoted that the man named Vance was a reckless libertine with no morals, who couldn't walk straight at the sight of a woman. Ethan asked what else he had said. Willow told him he'd said that if he dared to have any improper thoughts about her, she was free to gouge out his eyes. Ethan felt wronged. He did appreciate beauty, and he liked to look at women of all shapes and sizes, but he had almost never had any lewd thoughts, especially not about a child like Willow. He shrugged, saying frankly that beauty in the world was a treasure. Each glance was a fleeting moment, and the beauty of today was different from the beauty of tomorrow. Admiring it was a good deed, not recklessness. Speechless, she noticed the shackle on his left wrist chained to the headboard. She felt a little better, a look of schadenfreude on her face. Ethan wasn't angry. He held the fan in his left hand and tapped her lightly on the forehead with it, telling her that was more like a child. Acting so old and serious was unbecoming. Willow was stunned by the tap, rubbing her forehead as she looked at him. She was there on Beckett's orders to try and get some information out of him. Ethan asked if her name was Willow and if Beckett was her uncle. Willow found him interesting and grew curious. She adopted a masculine posture, hooking one leg up on the bed and leaning against the carved wooden headboard, confirming it was so. Ethan guessed her age, asking if she had come in with her uncle. Willow said it was about that time 13 years ago. In front of others, Ethan had to be mindful of his words and actions. But with this girl, he didn't have to be so restrained. After all, she had never met him before. Even if she had heard things about him from Beckett, it was likely just bits and pieces. If possible, he might even be able to get some information about the Blight from her. He asked why they had been locked up in the Blight. Willow watched him, raising an eyebrow slightly. She said her uncle and the others thought she was too young and wouldn't tell her the details. Besides, she asked, shouldn't his mentor already know how they got there? Ethan thought, oh great. She was a clever one, not easy to fool. He had to change his approach with smart people. He opened his fan and fanned himself a few times, saying he just hadn't expected them to imprison a child. Willow's lips curled into a smile. She opened her palm, tracing the calluses there. She said she hadn't been born when they came to the Blight. After her mother and uncle were exiled, her uncle died protecting her mother. If they hadn't met Leo, who had bound her uncle's soul to his talismans and shared his energy, her uncle's spirit would have long since dissipated. Ethan frowned slightly, asking how Beckett had died. Willow replied that he had forgotten. Ethan wasn't surprised by this. Necromancers primarily used corpses and ghosts as weapons. Leo clearly specialized in the latter. Ghosts could be broadly divided into bright spirits and shadow spirits. Ghosts who remembered their past were called bright spirits. Their minds were clear, and their power was equal to when they were alive. Those with hazy memories were called shadow spirits. At the time of their death, parts of their souls were damaged or lost, or still attached to their mortal remains, leaving them in a confused state, wandering the world with diminished power. And the only thing that could turn a soul into a shadow spirit was an incredibly violent death. One that shattered the spirit and broke the soul. A death so painful the spirit refused to remember it. Ethan couldn't imagine what had happened back then. According to the original's fragmented memories, the righteous path was divided into 4 sanctums, each guarding a divine artifact. Serene Valley guarded the Void Bow, Havenfall guarded the Sorrowglass Mirror, Sunstone Peak guarded the Clarity Blade, and his own Ethelgard guarded the World Tome. Julian was a primordial demon. Being exiled for stealing artifacts made sense. But Beckett was the son of the Lord of Havenfall. Why would he and his sister steal their own sex artifact? What was the point? While Ethan's mind raced, Willow suddenly asked him what happened to his right hand. Ethan looked at the hole in his lindenwood hand and said with some regret that she must mean the hole, which he'd gotten just recently. Willow couldn't help but laugh. She said she wasn't asking about the hole, but why his hand was missing. Why indeed? To be honest, Ethan himself couldn't remember clearly. It was as if, when he was 5, he had been too mischievous and accidentally had his hand sliced off by a scythe while playing. He had bled profusely and fallen gravely ill, running a high fever for 3 days and not waking for a month. When he did, he was disabled. Fortunately, he still had one hand left, so it wasn't all bad. However, the mention of his right hand brought back the memory of his father caring for him tirelessly while he was injured. Now he was trapped in the Blight, with no idea how much time had passed outside. How were his father and sister doing? The thought made him distracted, and he didn't want to elaborate. He simply summed it up by saying it was a long story. Willow posed her second question. She asked if, in all his years outside, he had ever gone to look for his older brother, Evan Vance. The moment the question was out, Ethan was almost certain the girl had been sent by Beckett to sound him out. The trickiest part was that he couldn't find any memory of the original having a brother. Whether such a person even existed was a question. So how was he supposed to answer? If he went along with her, would he fall into her trap? In a few seconds, he had a plan. He looked directly into Willow's eyes and said, enunciating each word, that he did not have a brother. This answer made Willow frown, but before she could object, Ethan cut her off with a rare firmness. He lay back, resting his head on his hand, his expression indifferent, and repeated that he had no brother. Outside the tower, Beckett, who was listening in through his spiritual connection, smirked. In the past, whenever Ethan got anything good, he would always think of his brother first. Now, he finally realized his brother was no good. Leo's response was even more blunt. He said Evan Vance was a bastard and deserved to be disowned by his mentor. Beckett pressed a finger to his ear and gave an order to the other side, telling Willow to ask him why he came to the Blight and who sent him. But before Willow could ask, Beckett heard Ethan's lazy voice from the other end. He said Beckett must have sent her to ask him. Since she was caught, Willow didn't try to hide it. She asked directly, saying her uncle's suspicions were reasonable. It had been 13 years. No one had seen him or heard any news of him. After so many years, why had he suddenly appeared in the Blight? Ethan beckoned to Willow with his finger, telling her to come closer so he could whisper the answer. Willow naturally leaned in. Ethan's gaze flickered and he spotted a faint glow in Willow's right stone earring. Quick as a flash, he plucked the earring off and with a sharp pinch, crushed it. The earring was a manifestation of Beckett's spiritual sense, directly linked to his hearing. Couldn't withstand such treatment. He leaped up like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, clutching his ear and cursing Ethan's name. Ethan burst out laughing. On the other end, Beckett's face turned green. He formed a sign with his fingers, him to just wait. Instantly, the crushed earring in Ethan's palm transformed into a spider the size of a compass. Ethan's smile froze. It wasn't until the spider's hairy legs began to squirm between his fingers that he flung his hand away with a blood-curdling scream. Now it was Beckett's turn to slap his thigh and roar with laughter. Goosebumps erupted all over Ethan's skin. He scrambled back to the far corner of the bed, pulling on the golden chain, shaking with fear, his bones feeling like they were dissolving from the inside out. It felt as if tiny insects were crawling all over him, an unbearable sensation. Just then, the bamboo door was thrown open again. Julian rushed in, alarmed, calling out his mentor's name. Before Ethan could answer, he saw the spider crawling up the leg of the bed. His mind went blank. He scrambled off the bed and leaped into Julian's arms, wrapping his legs around his waist, tears welling in his eyes. He cried out that there was a bug. A warm, soft hand covered his eyes, blocking his view. Julian told him it was all right. His other hand lifted. The magically created spider instantly disintegrated into dust. He flicked a finger, catching the wisp of Beckett's spiritual energy that hadn't retreated in time, and pushed his palm forward. Outside the tower, thousands of vines erupted around Beckett. Before he could react, they dragged him underground. Beckett's furious shout was cut off as a vine gagged him. Soon, only his head remained above ground. Leo placed the repaired spear by his head and sat a short distance away, saying with disgust that he had brought this on himself. It took Ethan a long time to recover from his chilled limbs and tingling scalp. He blinked and asked if it was dead. The feeling of his eyelashes brushing against the palm was strange. Julian withdrew his hand, wrapped his arms around Ethan's waist, and rested his forehead against the back of his own hand, nuzzling it affectionately. His tone was gentle as he reassured his mentor that all troublesome things would die. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He felt there was a hidden meaning in those words. His legs went limp and he slid down from Julian. He shook his sweaty palms, trying to act casual, saying he was scared to death. He didn't know what the original's personality was like, but as number 1 on the celestial rankings, he probably wasn't afraid of bugs like he was. He peeked at Julian, observing his reaction. Julian smiled and took hold of Ethan's chain, telling him it was all right and that his mentor didn't need to be embarrassed. He asked if he didn't remember the time he was so scared by a parasitic worm that he blew up the entire Ghost Clan's altar. Ethan did not remember, had never heard of it, was mortified, and wanted to leave. Once the crisis was over, Ethan realized how intimate their posture was. The beauty before him was truly captivating, but he wasn't so foolish as to forget the history between the original and this villain. He pushed Julian away, saying a cool thanks. Before the words were even out, Julian yanked the chain without hesitation. Ethan lost his balance, stumbled, and crashed back into Julian's chest. His head was spinning from the impact. He looked up at Julian, asking what he was doing. Julian ignored him and told Willow to get out. Willow, who had been enjoying the show, hopped off the bed. Before leaving, she thoughtfully closed the door for them. Ethan was still a bit disappointed about not getting any information, his gaze following her until she disappeared. Julian's eyes shifted slightly. He asked if his mentor thought she was pretty. If it were Ethan's usual self, he would have been brutally honest, saying something like, "You're much prettier than her. If you didn't have a bigger package than me, I'd marry you in a heartbeat." But given the situation, he had to maintain his cool demeanor, telling him not to mess around. Julian's expression darkened at the word mess. He suddenly reached out and squeezed Ethan's cheeks. Within seconds, Ethan's face was numb, but Julian's eyes were the first to well up with moisture. He asked how much longer his mentor would be cold to him, how much longer he would punish him. "Damn it, kid. You murdered your master and betrayed your sect. I'm not crying, so why are you?" Ethan was in real pain, so his glare was unfriendly. He struggled to grab Julian's collar with his restricted left hand and shouted his name. Startled by the outburst, Julian's eyes looked wounded for a moment, then blazed with a fierce fire. A second later, he bit down hard on Ethan's collarbone. A real bite. It was so sharp it made Ethan's scalp tingle, and tears sprang to his eyes. Julian, now more dog than child, said hopefully for his mentor to say his name again. His feverish gaze seemed to want to set Ethan on fire. Although he couldn't figure out Julian's feelings for the original, to get away from him, Ethan suppressed his confusion and scolded him coldly. He told Julian that if he still considered him his mentor, he shouldn't tie him up here. He had saved his life today, and this was how he treated his savior. He asked if that was how he had taught him. Julian snapped out of it, hastily releasing Ethan and dropping to his knees before him. He stammered that his mentor was right, that he knew he was wrong. Ethan thought, great, now he understood. This kid was like a spinning top. He needed a good whipping. As he was thinking this, Julian looked up, pleading. "But mentor," he said, "the blight is truly dangerous. Locking you in the room is to keep you from wandering off and getting into more trouble." He couldn't lose his mentor again, not even for a second. He couldn't bear even the slightest risk. Ethan had always had a weakness for beautiful things, especially a face as pitiful as the one before him. For a moment, he even felt a surge of fatherly love that he couldn't suppress. Being bitten by the little mutt didn't seem so bad anymore. He took a deep breath and began to negotiate. He said he couldn't stay in the room all day. That was no better than being in prison. Although the blight itself was a giant prison, at least it was big. Julian thought about it, then reluctantly agreed, saying his mentor could walk around during the day. But he must not leave the tower and must come back at night. Although it wasn't much of an improvement, any concession was a win at this point. Ethan wasn't picky. As he nodded in agreement, Julian finally smiled. He bent down and swept Ethan into his arms. Ethan was shocked. Off balance, he instinctively wrapped his arms around Julian's neck, asking what he was doing now. Julian answered with complete sincerity that it was already nighttime. Ethan looked out the window and saw that the sky was the same as before. Julian explained that day and night were indistinguishable in the blight, but it was truly nighttime now. Ethan thought, "I'll believe that when pigs fly." Julian carried Ethan back to the bed and requested to sleep with him. Ethan knew protesting was useless. If he said anything harsh, he'd likely be met with a teary-eyed Julian looking as if he'd been grievously wronged. He simply closed his eyes, rolled to the innermost side of the bed, and made space. Julian climbed onto the bed happily, pulled up the covers, and carefully tucked Ethan in. He himself took up only a small space on the edge, covering himself with just a corner of the blanket, and then fell asleep contentedly. But Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned for a long time, finally facing Julian. After a moment of internal conflict, he used his right hand to hold the golden chain, preventing it from making any sound, while his left hand slowly drew the dagger from his waist. He pointed the tip down, aiming for the center of Julian's forehead. One strike was all it would take to end everything. He could leave this godforsaken wasteland. He could go back home to his father and sister. As long as he never picked up a pen to write this story again, he could sever all ties with this world forever. However, Ethan felt there was something inexplicably strange about it all. This was supposed to be a fictional world he had created. But after just one day here, he had a tangible sense of reality. These characters were no longer just ink on paper. They had flesh and blood, they moved and laughed, they got angry and played pranks, and they could be warm and affectionate, including Julian. He seemed like an untamable wolf, but when he held him, when he covered his eyes, and even now he had a real, tangible warmth. For Ethan, a quick resolution might be best. But the feeling of his characters coming to life was too profound. He couldn't convince himself he was just killing a fictional character. Ethan gave a self-deprecating chuckle, put away the dagger, and closed his eyes. He wasn't the real Ethan Vance. The hatred of a murdered master, the pain of being stripped of his power, he hadn't experienced any of it. Therefore, he found it difficult to feel any genuine hatred for Julian. On the contrary, he had a certain affection for him. Julian was a living person who had walked out of his dreams, onto his pages, and now stood before him. Ethan needed to find another reason to kill him. Otherwise, he just couldn't do it. After Ethan put down the dagger, resolved his inner conflict, and fell into a deep sleep, Julian slowly opened his eyes. His gaze rested on a point in the empty air, precisely where Ethan's dagger had been just moments before. He sat up silently, watching Ethan's sleeping face. Finally, he gently stroked Ethan's lips with his finger, murmuring, "Mentor," he whispered, "I've been wondering, where have you been all these years?" A moment later, a look of realization dawned on his face. He smiled faintly, talking to himself. He said, "I've guessed it. You were with the lamplighter, weren't you? I was in the blight, and you were in the real world with him every day. You listened to his lies and came to kill me. Is that it?" As he spoke, Julian raised his hand and closed it around Ethan's throat. His steady breathing circulated like a pearl under his palm. With just a little pressure, he could easily snap his windpipe. He held the position for an unknown length of time before finally releasing his grip, his expression complex. He whispered that he knew his mentor would come around eventually. It was all right, he would just wait a little longer. As he spoke, a faint, fresh scent of plants filled the room. Julian lay back down, but this time he was not as restrained as before. He wrapped his limbs around Ethan's warm body and pressed close to his ear, whispering in a breathy voice, "Thank you for not killing me today. But, Mentor, you deserve a little punishment." Having given up on the assassination, Ethan fell asleep quickly. But for some reason, his body began to heat up, burning hot. His limbs went limp and numb, and he had no strength at all. In his sleep, it felt as if something like a vine was climbing up his thigh, slowly and deliberately wrapping around his ankle, parting his legs, and coiling around them. It played with him patiently, occasionally dipping its head to take a sip from the gurgling stream it found there. Ethan wanted to struggle, but his limbs were weak and useless, as if he were wrapped in layers of soft but unyielding clouds and lifted into the air. He desperately wanted to break free from the strange dream but couldn't. When he finally woke with a start, his lips were dry, and his head was spinning. He tried to get up for some water, but as soon as his feet touched the ground, a sharp, aching weakness shot through his thighs. He couldn't support himself and collapsed to his knees. Julian was startled awake. He quickly got out of bed and wrapped his arms around Ethan from behind, asking what was wrong. At that moment, Ethan's body was extremely sensitive and couldn't bear to be touched. The contact almost made him kick Julian away. After a moment, he found his voice. He said it was nothing, just a nightmare, and asked for a glass of water. Ethan had no idea that at that moment, his cheeks were flushed, the teardrop mark under his eye vivid, giving him an unconsciously sensual beauty. Julian obediently went to get water, his back radiating an unmistakable joy, like a dog wagging its tail. Ethan was helped up and leaned against the headboard. He thought that this version of Julian was actually quite cute. In a corner of the Blight, there was a mountain range known as the Sealed Mountain, where yellow sand filled the sky and a biting wind blew. A faint, flickering light shone from a cave, looking as if it could be extinguished by the wind at any moment. Inside the cave, a leader wrapped in animal hides leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. He asked if the man was sure it was really Ethan Vance. A man below replied that he had seen it clearly as they retreated. The man standing next to Julian Astor was indeed Ethan Vance, the top disciple of Ethelgard. He said he had met him once on the day of the celestial rankings and remembered him clearly. The man in hides was overjoyed, clapping his hands and laughing. This was good, he said, very good. With him, they had a chance to escape the Blight. A murmur of confusion spread through the crowd. The man in hides suppressed his excitement and asked them who the current master of Ethelgard was. At the mention of that name, everyone gritted their teeth. A reluctant voice answered that it was the Lamplighter. The man in hides agreed, saying that as long as they captured Ethan Vance and made a deal with the Lamplighter, he would surely let them out. Someone raised an objection, saying the Lamplighter was a maniac who wanted them all dead, and why would he care about one Ethan Vance? The man in hides cackled strangely. He explained that the Lamplighter, just like Julian Astor, was raised by Ethan Vance himself. Everyone knew about Ethan's preferences. The prize students he mentored all ended up hopelessly devoted. His bond with the Lamplighter was especially strong. If they captured his mentor, they would have him by the throat. The more he spoke, the more excited he became, his expression turning fanatical. He said he was tired of being an outcast for so long. As long as they captured Ethan Vance, they could. A slender woman leaning against the cave wall, who had been thinking for a long time, interrupted his excited monologue. She asked if he didn't find Ethan Vance's sudden appearance in the Blight too strange. For over a decade, the only person who controlled the key to the Blight was the Lamplighter. How did he get in? She played with her freshly painted nails, a smile on her lips. She wondered if perhaps Ethan had failed to please the lamplighter in bed, or maybe the lamplighter had sent him with a task, such as killing his other dear student, Julian Astor. After all, Julian was now the de facto ruler of their corner of the Blight. If he was planning to break out, it would be a headache for the lamplighter. If either of those possibilities were true, capturing Ethan would be useless and might even backfire. The man in hides was speechless. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense, and he grew dejected. He said hatefully that it was true. Everyone knew Ethan Vance had killed his own master. A scoundrel like that was capable of anything. The woman clicked her tongue in disappointment and walked over to the man in hides. She sat down on his stone throne, pressing her chest against his arm, her smile radiant. But who said Ethan Vance was useless? She purred. The man in hides asked what she meant. The woman teased his chapped lips, saying the lamplighter was far away. But didn't he want to control Julian Astor? Didn't he want to take back the position of Lord of the Blight that Julian had stolen from him? A night passed. Ethan had recovered some of his strength. Although his knees still trembled when he stood up, he could at least stand steady. The golden shackle on his wrist had vanished along with Julian. Strangely, there were no marks left where he had been bound, and there was no pain when he moved. Ethan got out of bed and found the bathtub filled with hot, steaming water. He didn't stand on ceremony and took a long, comfortable bath. After getting dressed, he picked up the fan from the headboard and went out for some air. A light rain was falling outside. As soon as he stepped out of the tower, he saw the resentful face of Beckett, who was still buried up to his neck. The moment Beckett saw him, his face turned green, but he couldn't look away and could only glare up at him from ground level. For some reason, seeing Beckett's clenched jaw expression made Ethan want to tease him. He squatted down and asked with great concern what had happened. Leo, who was shielding Beckett from the rain with a large leaf, politely told Ethan that he was being punished by Julian for playing a trick on his mentor yesterday. Hearing the reason, Ethan fanned Beckett with his fan, gloating, saying it must be tough for him. Beckett's face screamed, "Get lost." The more he acted like that, the more Ethan wanted to bully him. He reached out to pat Beckett's head but felt nothing. Only then did he remember Beckett was dead, and what he saw was just a spirit. A mortal couldn't touch him. Just as a flicker of sympathy arose in Ethan, Beckett glared at him to just wait until he got out, and then he would beat him senseless. Ethan's sympathy vanished instantly. He casually tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear and winked at Beckett, cooing for him to come and get him then. Beckett was thoroughly disgusted and wished he could climb out right then and there to strangle this menace. While he was happily teasing Beckett, Ethan faintly heard a woman singing in the forest. The melody was beautiful, smooth as silk, and sweet as a nightingale, accompanied by the occasional rustle of bamboo, like a distant drum. He looked and saw Celeste, the bone woman with healing powers, emerging from the bamboo grove. When their eyes met, her singing stopped abruptly, and her entire skeleton trembled. After staring at him for a long moment, she seemed to realize something and fled back into the bamboo. Ethan remembered writing about a woman in his book who specialized in healing arts and was indeed a skeleton. If someone was injured, as long as the bones were not damaged, she could transfer the wounds to herself, healing the other person. The day before, she had used this art to heal Julian's burns. But Ethan didn't know what her relationship with the original Ethan was. Seeing him, she seemed to want only to hide. Leo watched her retreating back, then looked at Ethan and asked softly if his mentor didn't recognize her. Most of Leo's face was hidden by the Dung Ning Goi Manjir, so Ethan couldn't see his expression, but he could hear the unspoken regret in his voice. Ethan played along, asking who she was. Beckett made a sound, signaling Leo not to speak. Leo pursed his lips. He said she had specifically told them not to tell him last night. But it wasn't hard to guess. The pale blue ribbon in her hair was identical to the one Julian wore. It was probably a unique token of Ethelgard. Her bones were washed clean, as white as jade. Even with only her long hair left, she always made sure it was neatly styled before going out. She must have been someone who cherished her beauty. In Ethan's fragmented memories, there was indeed such a beautiful woman with the last name Bell, named Celeste Bell. She was the youngest disciple at Ethelgard, more beautiful than a flower, radiant as a cloud, skilled in music, lively, and always smiling. And now she was just a skeleton, singing her laments in the forest. Ethan knew but pretended not to. He smiled faintly, fanning himself, saying it was strange, that he couldn't guess who she was. But just from her bones, she was exquisite, the framework of a true beauty. Buried in the ground, Beckett said disdainfully that in his eyes, every woman was a beauty. Ethan closed his fan, saying that every woman had her own beauty. Some had beauty in the flesh, some in the bone, a concept he wouldn't understand. Hidden in the forest, Celeste heard every word Ethan said. Hot tears streamed down her face, and she turned and ran. Her bare, white feet rustled on the dry bamboo leaves. After teasing Beckett enough, Ethan walked a slow circle around the tower, lost in his own thoughts. Everything here was slightly different from what he had imagined. There were no hordes of followers or legions of ghosts. It was just a lonely tower. Julian had been in the Blight for over a decade but hadn't built up his own forces. This puzzled Ethan. To him, this place didn't seem like a dangerous den, but more like a peaceful retreat for Julian and his few friends. However, judging from the group that had attacked them yesterday, their lives weren't entirely peaceful. Julian was nowhere to be seen. Beckett was still planted in the ground, with Leo beside him. Willow was also gone. Even the ghosts Leo had controlled yesterday were nowhere in sight. It was truly empty. Ethan tucked the fan into his sleeve and wandered around the tower like a young master touring an opera house, feeling quite bored. This was annoying. He was tired of this game. He wanted to go home. After completing a circle, Ethan found a dry spot and sat down cross-legged, saying aloud for them to come out. Ethan knew that since he had left the tower, someone had been following him. But the person was quite gentlemanly about it, silent and keeping a respectful distance, and very patient. After being called out, a person emerged from behind the tower. Ethan was surprised. It wasn't Julian as he had expected, but a stranger. A young man dressed like a scholar. He wore a simple red robe washed so many times it had faded to white, but it was clean and neat. He held a plain white horsetail whisk, looking very elegant. His features were handsome, as if he were born to embody the phrase gentle as jade. The man walked to Ethan's side and greeted him with a slight smile, saying his name. Ethan frowned in concentration, running through the characters he had written in his mind. He was fairly certain of the man's identity. He patted the ground beside him, gesturing for the man to sit. The man sat down, his posture perfect, his gaze straight ahead, his back as straight as a pine tree. Ethan felt that compared to him, his own posture was like a pile of mud. But of course, he had no intention of changing. Ethan recalled the name he had heard from Julian yesterday and tried to match it. He guessed, Caleb? Apparently, he was lucky and got it right on the first try. The man smiled warmly at him and confirmed. Ethan sighed. It really was him. Caleb was gentle and his voice was very soft, as if filtered through a clear stream. He explained that Julian had asked him to follow and protect him. In front of him, Ethan couldn't play any tricks. He thanked him. Caleb kindly advised him that his posture was improper. Ethan continued to slouch comfortably, saying it was comfortable this way. He spoke casually, but his eyes never left Caleb. Caleb, of course, had no idea what Ethan was thinking. He fumbled in his pocket for a moment, then politely invited him to have some candy. He opened his fist to Ethan, revealing 2 pieces of something wrapped in colorful cellophane. Ethan took one and unwrapped it. Inside was a small stone, about the size of a fingernail. Caleb highly recommended it, saying it was delicious. Ethan turned the stone over in his palm, asking if it was candy. Caleb nodded, assuring him it was. He said he wanted to eat candy, and Willow had found this for him, telling him it was candy. Ethan played with the small stone and found it was washed very clean. He confirmed with Caleb one more time, asking if he swallowed the candy. Caleb obediently replied that he didn't. He said Willow and her mother had told him not to swallow it, that it was bad. Ethan affirmed that was correct, you shouldn't swallow candy. Without further hesitation, he popped the small stone into his mouth and grinned at Caleb. Caleb put the remaining stone in his mouth, his expression of happiness more like a child's than an adult's. The stone, of course, had no taste, but Ethan pretended to enjoy it. To be honest, Ethan's feelings about this Caleb were completely different from his feelings about the others. When he met Beckett, because he was so eager to kill him, Ethan hadn't had any strong emotional reaction. When he met Julian, his mind was so preoccupied with the mission from the Arbiter of Worlds that he was too nervous to have any other thoughts. But seeing Caleb, Ethan's mind was not so calm. Because Caleb was the only character in the book for whom Ethan had written a backstory. Combining this with the original's faint memories, Ethan knew that he was originally the top disciple of Sunstone Peak, but had been attacked by warlocks and beaten so badly that his mind was broken. In other words, Caleb now had the mental capacity of a 5 or 6-year-old. He couldn't even tell the difference between candy and a stone. Ethan guessed that 13 years ago, it was because of his mental disability that he had helped Julian steal the artifact, leading to his exile in the Blight. Seeing Caleb, Ethan couldn't help but think that if he had written a more positive and interesting story, perhaps these people would be much happier. They wouldn't be trapped in this giant prison, one driven mad, another obsessed, another simple-minded. While Ethan was lost in thought, Caleb, who had just shared his candy, suddenly changed his expression. He shook the whisk in his hand and held it defensively at Ethan's side. Before Ethan could react, several plum blossom-shaped throwing knives shot out from the right like streaks of fire, striking Caleb's whisk with a clang. Caleb's wrist moved with fluid grace, rapping, pulling, and shaking the whisk. He used it to deflect all the knives back to where they came from. Instantly, several screams came from the woods. Judging by the sounds, they had been turned into pincushions by their own knives. Caleb held the whisk in one hand and drew a short sword from his waist with the other, on full alert. He faced the direction the knives had come from and ordered Ethan to get back to the tower. He said Julian had told him that if anything happened to him, he would take away all his candy. It was a very severe punishment indeed. Ethan suspected that in Caleb's eyes, he was just a walking piece of candy. Despite his inner thoughts, Ethan knew his own limitations. He wasn't about to stay and be a burden. He turned to run but was grabbed by the arm by a figure who appeared out of nowhere. Ethan was stunned. Caleb turned sharply and saw who it was. His tense expression relaxed considerably. He said Julian's name and told him to quickly take Ethan to the tower. Hearing this, the Julian gave a cold smile. The hand gripping his arm was too strong. Ethan suddenly felt something was wrong. He looked up and saw the Julian's eyes flash with the yellow glow of a wolf's. The person grinned at him, revealing 2 sharp canine teeth, like a carnivorous monster looking at its fresh prey, deciding where to take the first bite. Ethan was terrified and told Caleb to wait, that this wasn't, but Caleb didn't notice. He casually pushed Ethan toward the Julian, telling him to hurry back to the tower. A chill went through Ethan's heart, but before the cold could fully set in, the triumphant smile on the imposter's face froze. His body fell forward uncontrollably. Ethan quickly dodged, watching him fall face first to the ground, convulsing. His spine was broken in the middle. There was a deep finger-width hole there. The real Julian stood behind him, slowly wiping his hands with a handkerchief. Only then did he gently pull Ethan to his side, asking his mentor if he was hurt. Ethan, still shaken, shook his head and looked at the fake Julian on the ground. The dying Julian on the ground's features twisted like dough before returning to their original form. A sallow-faced, bearded man in animal hides. The man's back was broken, the pain unbearable. He gritted his teeth and groaned, asking Julian how he was there. Julian squatted down, grabbed his hair, and smiled. He asked how he would know who would take advantage of his absence to harm his mentor if he always stayed in the tower. The man's throat was filled with blood, his voice hoarse and terrible. He said the scout had clearly reported he was 100 miles away at Blue Bridge Slope. Julian's reply was casual, as if telling a small joke. He said it was only 100 miles and he ran very fast. The man knew he was going to die, so he summoned all his strength and let out a tragic roar, calling Julian a monster. Julian's expression didn't change. He bent his finger and, with a smile, struck the top vertebra of the man's spine, turning his unfinished curses into a series of piercing screams. "You used my face to hold my mentor," Julian said. "Do you want to die?" "No," he added, "that's too easy for you." Right there in front of Ethan, like cracking a walnut, he crushed every single one of the man's vertebrae. The man in hides had long since passed out. After turning him into a pile of mangled flesh, Julian ordered the somewhat bewildered Caleb to capture everyone in the woods on the right, to keep them alive. He said he would personally send them to their deaths. Caleb didn't move, his dark eyes staring at Julian. Julian showed a hint of confusion and repeated his order to go. Caleb still didn't move. Ethan reacted more quickly than Julian. He said he wouldn't take his candy this time for failing to protect him, but there wouldn't be a next time. Caleb asked happily if he was serious. Ethan confirmed it. Caleb's figure flickered and he vanished. A moment later, more weak cries came from the woods. After sending Caleb off, Ethan looked at the barely breathing man in hides on the ground and frowned, asking if this man was after him. When it was just the two of them, Julian put on an exceptionally innocent and harmless expression. His hands behind his back, as if the pile of pulp on the ground had nothing to do with him, and confirmed it was so. Ethan understood. In that case, he deserved it. After Ethan's silence, Julian shed his ruthless demeanor completely and cautiously sidled up to him. "Mentor," he asked, "was I a little too reckless just now?" The big bad wolf, who had just nonchalantly broken a man's bones, had instantly transformed into a little puppy. Seeing this, Ethan felt a pang of guilt. Julian was his creation. When he had designed him with a stroke of his pen, he had made him bloodthirsty, irritable, and domineering. In the end, it was his fault. So not only was he not afraid of him, his conscience actually ached a little. "I'm sorry, son," he thought. "It was Dad who made you this way." Besides, after living in the Blight for over a decade, Julian must be used to a kill-or-be-killed life. Being invaded on his own turf, it was understandable that he would be ruthless. And they had come to capture him, likely to use him against Julian. If he had been captured, his fate wouldn't have been any better. He could have easily been killed by them. Moreover, being merciful to an enemy who attacked first was not in line with his own usual style. In terms of cruelty, the way he had killed the razor monster yesterday with the dagger meant for Julian wasn't exactly kind. However, while Ethan could understand, the original mentor who had raised Julian certainly couldn't. Ethan put on an indifferent expression and kicked the man's face with the tip of his shoe, telling him to keep him alive, that he had a use for him. Then, he nonchalantly stepped away from Julian. Behind him, the light in Julian's eyes dimmed. He clenched his fists, his eyes filled with deep regret. If that bastard hadn't held his mentor in front of him, he would never have lost control and acted so brutally, ruining his image in his mentor's eyes. Julian silently composed himself and looked up at the sky, whistling again. Summoned, Celeste soon appeared from another bamboo grove. She avoided Ethan's gaze and walked slowly to Julian. Julian whispered something to her. She agreed and then, with her head down, picked up the man in hides like a bag of trash and carried him toward the tower. Throughout, she never made eye contact with Ethan. Ethan tactfully avoided looking at her, instead turning his attention to the woods where Caleb was cleaning up, pondering his own plans. For now, Ethan had no intention of assassinating Julian. Therefore, surviving in the Blight became his top priority. He remembered clearly what the Arbiter of Worlds had told him. Julian and his group were planning to escape the Blight and return to the real world to seek revenge. And there were definitely other factions in the Blight besides Julian's. He had no idea what the other groups were like, where they were located, or how powerful they were. Most importantly, where was the exit from the Blight? And how could he escape? Ethan knew his appearance in the Blight was too abrupt. Beckett's suspicion that he was a spy was perfectly reasonable. And Julian's willingness to take him in and trust him so completely was likely due to his judgment being clouded by their past relationship. If he rashly asked Julian these questions and aroused his suspicion, he would be the one getting his spine crushed piece by piece. In short, Ethan needed a reliable source of information. The man on the ground was a source delivered right to his door. Whether he was reliable was another question, but it was better than nothing. After Celeste left, Julian returned to Ethan's side and asked meekly if the forest was familiar to his mentor, saying he had planted it. To be honest, after staring at it for a while, Ethan did find it a bit familiar. In the original's fragmented memories, there seemed to be a forest of fiery red maple trees. The forest seemed to trigger a memory point in Ethan. What had been a coin-sized fragment of memory began to expand and clear up over time. A wave of intense dizziness suddenly hit him, numbing his senses. He couldn't stand and fell backward. In a daze, he heard someone frantically calling his name, over and over. A complete scene, like a raft emerging from a vast sea of consciousness, appeared in his mind. It was the first complete memory fragment Ethan had retrieved from the original's shattered mind. The late autumn red maple forest painted the mountains in the ripe red of persimmons. The mountain range, known as the Serpent's Crest, unfolded like a beauty's elegant eyebrows. Where the clouds thinned at the horizon and the riverbank met the water, a young boy sat on a green rock at the source of a stream, dangling his feet in the water. He wore a simple tunic made of woven reeds and held a fist-sized, strangely colored fruit, which he was munching on as if it were an ordinary berry. A wave of spiritual energy passed by, but the boy didn't react, continuing to eat with his head down. The wind rustled, and 2 junior disciples from Havenfall Isle arrived on flying weapons, landing in front of the boy. Havenfall disciples' uniforms were easily recognizable. A navy blue base with gold-embroidered cloud patterns on the shoulders and sleeves, looking quite grand. They were identifiable as junior disciples because they both carried long spears of white oak, unlike the senior disciples who wielded steel lances forged from the bones of demonic beasts. Both of them frowned at the boy. One, a taller disciple, pointed his spear at the boy and asked rudely where he had gotten the glimmer fruit he was holding. The boy wiped the juice from his mouth and pointed west. The other, shorter disciple was skeptical. He said that in Serpent's Crest lived a beast called the Gorgon, and the glimmer fruit was its favorite food. The fruit ripened only once every 5 years, and there were fewer than 100. The Gorgon treasured them, and would drain the blood and water from anyone who dared to compete with it. He asked who the boy was to challenge a Gorgon for its food. The boy slowly bit into the fruit, mumbling that he wanted to eat it, and since it wouldn't give it to him, he took it. The tall disciple sized up the boy. He saw that apart from his delicate, almost feminine features, he had no trace of spiritual energy. He looked like an ordinary child. His tone became contemptuous. He scoffed at his audacity. The short disciple nudged the tall one, motioning for him to look at the boy's feet. The tall disciple looked and gasped. 5 or 6 glimmer fruits were strung together on a vine, wrapped around the boy's ankle, swinging back and forth, making the 2 disciples' eyes burn with greed. Seeing this, the tall disciple immediately softened his tone, addressing him as young master. The boy glanced at them and went back to chewing on the glimmerfruit's core, meticulously scraping every bit of sweet pulp into his mouth. The tall disciple didn't want to beg this strange kid, but considering their situation, he suppressed his anger, saying again that they were disciples of Havenfall and asked if he had heard of them. The boy was non-committal, not answering. The short disciple continued for him, holding his spear and bowing respectfully. He explained that there were 4 great sanctums of adepts, and Havenfall was one of them. Every 2 years, they held a solstice ritual requiring various offerings to the celestial sovereign. The ritual had evolved into a competition between the 4 sanctums. Whoever collected the most offerings in the allotted time would become the chief officiant. If a junior disciple could offer even 1 item, they would have a chance to enter the inner sanctum. He pointed at the glimmer fruit on the boy's ankle, his eyes filled with greed. He said the glimmer fruit needed for the ritual was here in Serpent's Crest, but their powers were too weak to venture into the Gorgon's territory. He asked if the young master could spare them just one of the fruits he had found. The boy lifted his leg, and a glimmer fruit detached from the vine and landed perfectly in his hand. He wiped it and said in a childlike voice that the fruit wasn't as good as the legends claimed, but he wouldn't give it to them. The 2 disciples frowned in unison, asking why. He said he didn't like them. The boy bit into the glimmer fruit, his voice clear and sharp, with a kind of innocent arrogance. He said he had grown up in the mountains and didn't know much about etiquette, but he knew at least that if they were truly asking for something, they should be kneeling, not standing there so straight. The 2 disciples' faces changed color. They warned him not to push his luck. The boy ignored them, jumped off the rock, and started walking away through the water. In an instant, a spear flashed, and its tip was at the boy's neck. Despite the blade, the boy was unafraid. His beautiful, almond-shaped eyes swept over the 2, filled with disdain. He told them the fruit was his, and he didn't want to give it to them. The tall disciple holding the spear ignored him and ordered the short one to go and get the fruit. The short disciple bent down to take them. The boy smiled, pinching his fingers together to form a sign. A flash of red light flickered at the corner of his eye, and the crimson mark on his forehead pulsed. The ground beneath them began to stir, as if countless snakes were slithering below. The loose soil trembled, as if a monster was about to burst forth. The short disciple stumbled, planting his spear deep into the ground to steady himself. He asked nervously if the Gorgon was coming. The tall one gritted his teeth, yelling at him to hurry up and take the fruit so they could leave. The short disciple reached out, but then a sharp whistle cut through the air. A 3-inch throwing knife, wreathed in flames, flew through the air and pinned his sleeve. It lifted him off his feet and slammed him against a nearby red maple tree. The boy was startled. The fingers he held together immediately separated, and the red glow in his eyes and on his forehead vanished. He looked around, searching for the source of the knife. The short disciple was pinned, frantically trying to pat out the flames on his sleeve. The tall one immediately pulled back his spear and pointed it into the empty air, demanding to know who was there. Before he could finish his curse, he too was hit by a flaming knife, his body flying into another red maple tree. His spear fell into the stream beside the boy. The two struggled desperately to free their sleeves from the knives, but the spiritual energy had pinned them fast to the tree trunks. They couldn't even rip their sleeves to get free. The tall one, trying to hide his fear, demanded to know who was there, his voice trembling uncontrollably. After a long silence, a playful voice drifted from the treetops. He said he was their conscience. He was hurt that they hadn't spoken to him in so long. The tall one, now frantic, started yelling, asking who was playing tricks and telling them to come out. Before the trickster could reveal himself, dozens of glowing, 3-inch knives shot out from the woods, thudding into the tree trunks around the two, outlining their bodies in blades. As the two trembled in fear, a white figure descended gracefully from the woods. The man had his hands behind his back. He wore a snow-white robe and a black gauze cap with a cloud pattern. His long hair was simply tied back with a pale blue ribbon. He landed lightly on the bank of the stream. A 6-sided bell on his wrist was the source of the tinkling sound. The two disciples, who had just been furious, were now even more terrified when they saw who it was, stammering his name. The boy stood curiously in the stream, looking up at the handsome young man. The youth, addressed as mentor, walked calmly to the streamside and held out his right hand. With a twist and a clench of his palm, all the knives pinning the two disciples flew back into his hand. They melted and reformed into a bamboo fan. He waved the fan a couple of times, a smile in his eyes. The boy's curiosity grew. The two brothers fell from the trees, their clothes torn, their faces ashen. The short one's sleeve was burned. He tried to cover it while hastily explaining, telling his mentor not to misunderstand, that they had just seen the glimmer fruit on the child and wanted to ask for one. The youth walked over to the boy and looked down, seeing the glimmer fruit strung on the vine around his ankle. Perhaps because the youth was so handsome, the boy felt a little shy and unconsciously hid his foot. The youth's eyebrow raised when he saw the precious fruit so casually strung together. He boldly reached out and patted the boy's soft hair. He asked the two brothers if this child was the Gorgon. The boy's lip twitched, but he managed not to flinch from the touch. The two brothers didn't dare to breathe.